Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ethnobotanical Linguistics in the Age of Remote Fieldwork, a case study of woolly iron. I want to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Kuleana of the Hawaiian people to these lands on which I am privileged to work and study, lands which were ceded under duress. I extend that respect to any Indigenous, First Nation, or Native people from whose lands you may virtually be joining me today. First of all, an outline of my presentation. I will begin with some background on my specific project working with woolly iron. I will then talk about a sort of general workflow techniques that worked and other technological tools that we found useful for this project. I will next focus specifically on the ethnobotanical linguistics, looking at what plants did we talk about, how did we know which plants to talk about, how did we identify these plants remotely without having physical specimens in front of us, things like that. And lastly, I will have a brief discussion of what worked well, what some limitations of this method are, and what my future plans are for this research. Woolly iron is a Micronesian language of the Chukik subfamily. I was introduced to both this language and our language expert, Lenny, through a hybrid field methods course, and later to Lenny's cousin, Carter. Both Lenny and Carter are from Yurupik Atoll in the Federated States of Micronesia, as you can see an image there in the bottom. Specifically, they are from Yurupik Island, which is the little dark dot with an arrow pointing at it in that image. Yurupik is less than 1/10 of a square mile, so it is a very small island. But nonetheless, when speaking with Lenny, we were able to identify roughly 5 mini biomes or landscapes on the island or around the island. So first of all, we had Washangateti, which is the outside or like the front of the island. Wash is that area on the reef, and the reef is that lighter part of the image you see, like the donut there. Wurapi is on the beach. Wurafetawa is the inland area, and Nimet is specifically the garden, farm, or cultivated area on the island. So my field methods class, as I mentioned, was hybrid, both online and in person. We began online due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but transitioned later into in-person work. Before I actually got started with my ethnobotanical linguistic research, I worked with my classmates to create a sketch grammar of the woolly iron language. Now, I want to define exactly what I mean by ethnobotanical linguistics. You can think of this as how people talk about their relationship with plants, or alternatively, what botanical knowledge is encoded in the language. Most of the work that I did for this botanical project took place when I was back on the mainland during the summer and Lenny and Carter were on Oahu. So in this way, it was doubly remote. I was remote from the language expert, Lenny and his cousin Carter, and Lenny and Carter were remote from Yurupik, the island with all the plants that we were talking about. My goals for this project were to contribute to both the linguistic and ethnobotanical literatures, but also to make a botanical field guide of sorts for the community to use that wrote down all of the knowledge that I was documenting from Lenny and Carter. I want to now talk about the general workflow techniques and technological tools that I used to do this research remotely. First of all, it's worth noting that even when I was able to meet with my language experts in person, most of the plants were still not physically available. So as you see in the bottom image there, Lenny and I are meeting in person, outdoors, there are plants around us, but most of those plants are not the plants that we were discussing for the project. Therefore, even when we did meet in person, we were using the computer a lot, looking at images of plants, things like that. When we transitioned to online, we used Zoom, and it was not that big of a transition because of that already needing to be semi-remote because the plants weren't there. So we used Zoom, and this in some ways actually had benefits over the in-person meetings because We were able to share screen and we're easily see what what we each were looking at and things like that. You can also see in the upper image here, again, that is me, Lenny, and Carter on Zoom. And here we are looking at a spreadsheet, my master spreadsheet of all of the information that I've been collecting on Woollian plants. And so I was able to very easily show that Google spreadsheet to Lenny and Carter. In general, Google Spreadsheets, Google Drive was a very useful tool for us in terms of sharing files and allowing everybody in the project to have easy access to all of the materials. Therefore, it was quite transparent what work we were doing, why I was doing this project. We also used Discord for a lot of our communication. Discord is a group messaging app somewhat similar to Slack, but in some ways more user-friendly. And it's very good for group conversations, but can also be used for one-on-one conversations. So my field methods course had a group conversation with all of us and Lenny, but I also have a specific chat just with Lenny, as you can see in the upper image here, where in addition to doing things like planning meetings, you can also use Discord to share files. And so you can see here, I'm sharing both Elan files and links to Google Drive. In addition to that, I used a technique that we developed in my field methods class of lending a physical recorder to Lenny, so that when we were on Zoom, we were recording the session, so we had fairly decent audio and video from Zoom, but we also had a physical recorder with Lenny so that there was also higher quality audio of him speaking, and that can be used for phonetic and phonological analysis. I want to now move on to talking about the ethnobotanical side of things, specifically how we talked about plants and how we identified those plants remotely. So first of all, I collected a variety of information about these plants. I collected the Woollian names, of course, as well as the Latin or scientific names, the English names, and when relevant, also the Hawaiian name of the plant. I also collected descriptions of what those plants were. So for example, that might be the size of the plant, the colors, any sort of associated plants and animals, location where the plant grows, and any relevant growing season. And the uses of the plant. So that could be if the plant is used for food or medicine, decoration, building materials, tools, anything like that. I collected these two pieces of information largely based on the theory by Ong-See, his web of use that he mentions. And so that web of use is basically the idea of collecting all of the language that is used when talking about these plants. So that can include things like the description of the plant, the use of the plant, but also things like how it's prepared, any cultural or religious significance, or any knowledge of how the plant interacts with the broader ecosystem. In Ong-See's case, this was largely collecting language in the target language, so in my case, that would be Woollian, but for my project, I used a mix of Woollian and English to collect this information. Lastly, for each plant, I tried to get photos, several photos that could be used for making it clear which plant I'm talking about, identifying the plant, things like that. And I based these photos off of the system by Baskauf and Kirchhoff, where they describe exactly what sort of photos you need to have clear identification of plants from images instead of from physical specimens of plants. So for example, if I want to take an image of a tree, then I probably want a close-up of the bark, a close-up of the leaves, both the front and the back of the leaves, but also an image of the full tree as best I can, perhaps things like buds, flowers, any fruits or nuts that the trees might produce, things like that. Whereas if I'm taking an image of, or I'm documenting a fern, I will have different photos. I will have photos close up of the fronds with the spores on them and the base of the fern, things like that. So I followed this methodology for both those plants that I actually was able to take photos of in person, and also when I was gathering open source images from the internet of these plants. Now, in terms of determining exactly what plants to talk about, we used a variety of different methods. First of all, I relied on the knowledge that I had of familiar plants on Oahu that I thought might grow in Europic and that I knew were useful or prevalent on Oahu and might therefore be useful or prevalent on Europic. This was actually fairly successful, but in addition to that, I supplemented by going through lists of Micronesian plants that other people have compiled. So Sohn and Tuolaman have a dictionary of Woolliian that includes a number of different plant species. And this dictionary is from the 1970s, so it's a little bit outdated by now. And also they were focusing more on Woolliai, which is a nearby island that also uses Woolliian, but in a slightly different way than how Europic does. And so there was not a one-to-one correspondence between the information in that dictionary and the information that Lenny and Carter knew, but it was still a really good jumping off point. I also used a compilation of photos of useful plants that are more broadly seen in Micronesia by Dana Lee Ling. And lastly, as you can see on the lower image, I used the website iNaturalist. This is a website where people can take photos of plants that they see, upload them, identify them as best they can, and it's very useful in doing this remote work because as you can see, you can type in something specific, like I want to only look at grasses, sedges, and cattails. And I only want those plants that people have said that they have taken photos of in the Federated States of Micronesia. So once I have this limited set of things, then we can scroll through these images of grasses that are found in Micronesia, and Lenny or Carter can be like, oh yeah, that one, I know that one. This is the name in Woolliian, this is the uses, this is where it's found. And then the nice thing is that that image is generally associated with the scientific name already. When iNaturalist was not able to help me with identifying plants, I also made use of Google Images. And so this works in two ways. For one, I can, if I have the Latin name, but don't have any images, I can go on Google Images to show Lenny and Carter what plant I'm talking about and see if they recognize it and know anything about it. But also, if they spot a plant and it doesn't necessarily have the Latin name on that particular image, then I can use Google Lens to search that image like you would search a word, but instead searching the photo, and that can show up similar images, and therefore I can use that to find the Latin name for something if we only have a few images. Now, all of these techniques so far have more been based on my or other people's knowledge of plants, but I also had some methods for talking about plants that were more Lenny or Carter offering the information of which plants we should even be talking about, which plants are important, that thing, those sorts of things. I did this in two ways. First of all, by using free listing. So as you can see on the lower two images here, free listing, I basically asked Lenny and Carter separately to write in a Google Doc plants that fit certain criteria. So for example, that might be write inland plants that are good for eating, or plants that are good for firewood, plants that are small and maybe don't fit in any other category, like little plants, plants that only grow on the beach, that sort of thing. And they list these plants, and the idea with this is that those plants that they list are the most salient or most important in those categories. I also asked Lenny to describe each of those landscapes that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, like the reef and the beach and inland, things like that. And based on these descriptions, I had him do them in Woolliian, and then we transcribed them in Alan, as you see in the upper image. And I had him describe, like, for example, describe the beach. What plants do you see? What animals do you see? What is it like there? And that is where I got a lot of the more surrounding web of use, language-based information about these plants. And these descriptions can also be used as starting off points that we can then talk about the specific plants that he mentioned. Another technique that I used was loosely based on Berlin et al.'s pile sorting method. So the idea here is you have a bunch of images of plants and you sort them into different piles based on a certain criteria. So I use Berlin et al.'s criteria after confirming with Lenny and Carter that these criteria made sense in their context. So these criteria are cultivated plants, or we translated that into Woolleian as plants that are owned by somebody. Protected plants, so these are the plants that aren't owned by anyone, weren't planted by anyone, but people know where they are, they go there regularly to maintain those plants. Useful plants that grow wildly, and plants that grow wildly and are not so useful, which we translated into Woolleian as sort of the remaining plants. So I used Google Jamboard for this, which is a Google app which lets you on different computers at the same time collaboratively move images around or draw or add little sticky notes, things like that. So it was really useful for this task because I could have Lenny and Carter together either on their own computer or on separate computers discuss which plants from the images belonged in which of those 4 quadrants and drag them into those areas. So in the top image, that would be pre-sorting, and the bottom image is after sorting the plants. And these discussions were in Woolleian, and that's another thing that we went through on Elan and transcribed. Next steps. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the research or stuff that I still have planned for this project. First of all, there were some plants that we struggled to identify. As you can see on the upper image, there is Kir, and that is a plant that all we know is it's sort of a tree. It has cherry-like berries. It grows kind of near the shore, but maybe also inland. And if the fruit is dipped in salt water of the ocean, that can make it tastier. And that's all the information we have so far, and I have not been able to identify it. I've not been able to find any images or Latin name based on that description. So I have a couple methods or a couple plans for how to identify these plants. First of all is that Lenny is actually visiting Europic and will be able to hopefully get some images of plants and also check in with other people in the community about this project and see if they can help fill in, if you maybe remembered a plant but couldn't remember or wasn't so confident on the Woolleian name, things like that. The other plan is to consult with Micronesian botanical experts who might be able to identify that plant from the description that I just said of Kir, for example. I also plan to make the botanical field guide, which has been waiting until we can identify and get images for all of the plants. So the lower image here is a very rough sketch of what I expect that field guide to look like. You can see there's images, multiple images of each plant, the Woolleian name, the English name, the scientific name and family, information about where it grows, what sort of plant it is, the uses of the plant, things like that. Most of this will be in English, but some will also be in Woolleian. For example, I will also have those landscape descriptions written out and transcribed from Woolleian into English. And lastly, of course, there's a lot of information here that I still plan on analyzing, especially on the linguistic front. There were a couple limitations to this method. So first of all, I was very lucky in that all parties involved in my research here had the technological skills and reliable internet to do this kind of work remotely. And that will not always be the case for remote language documentation. I will note, though, that it seemed that using Zoom, screen sharing on Zoom, and using Elan to transcribe all at once was a little bit much for some of our computers. But other than that, we were very lucky that we did not run into any issues on the technological front. Another limitation is that Lenny and Carter have not been to Europic for a little while, and so did have to rely on their memory of what plants were there and the names of the plants that they might not encounter as regularly on Oahu. Also, because we were remote from the community, it was more challenging to connect with other members of the community. Europic does not have reliable internet access, so I was not able to speak with people who are on Europic. And lastly, of course, we did not actually have very many physical plant specimens. We had to rely on images of plants, largely that other people have taken. However, the resource that I mentioned earlier with how to take photos of plants finds that this is sufficient for identifying plants, although other botanists may believe otherwise. So we did our best with what was available to us. That said, the methods that we use still worked to attain fairly detailed botanical and ethnobotanical information on over 100 plants. And considering, remember that Europic is less than 1/10 of a mile across and around, that is a fairly large number of plants. And so this is still a fairly good alternative for doing ethnobotanical linguistic work remotely due to COVID-19 or other restrictions, provided that you have the technological means. Doing this remotely also avoided the carbon footprint of travel and any other drains on resources that might come with visiting Europic directly. I would like to acknowledge and give very big thanks to Lenny and Carter for their work with me on this project, as well as Belinsky Foundation for funding, Bradley, my professor, and my classmates in my field methods course, staff at the Lyon Arboretum who I consulted with, and many other people who have guided me throughout this project. And here are my references. Thank you very much for listening.